morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. For all those people that are worried that they don't know what they're going to be doing with Game of Thrones over, welcome to 5G. There's so much in this space that all you have to do is open the paper, click on an email, and there's about every geopolitical, technical, and economic angle that you can imagine. So don't worry, we'll fill that space with plenty of knowledge. So this morning, I am joined by Ambassador Robert Strayer, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cyber and International Communications and Information Policy. That all fits on a card, where he leads the development on international cybersecurity, internet, data, and privacy policy and related negotiations with foreign governments. He has led many bilateral, multilateral dialogues on behalf of our government with foreign governments, and he has been working with foreign affairs and communications ministries worldwide. Most recently, for those of you who are familiar with the ITU Plenipotentiary Conference, it's a 3-week conference. Yes, in this day and age, we have 3-week conferences. It's kind of like training for the triathlon for technology and telecom geeks. He was our major point person, and where the key issues were cybersecurity, as well as spectrum and IoT. So a lot of the issues that we are coming upon, he has been spending a lot of time with. He also successfully managed the election of a U.S. citizen to the ITU senior management position, and also the first woman in 154 years. Pretty excited about that. He recently was a participant in the U.S.-EU cyber dialogue, so he's been talking about this a lot, as well as before he joined the State Department, he was the general counsel for the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee under the leadership of Bob Corker. From 2005 to 2011, he was one of the early people to be on the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, where he drafted cybersecurity legislation. And then 2 weeks ago, Ambassador Strayer delivered a very straightforward testimony to the Senate Judiciary Committee on the importance of 5G, next-generation networks, and the need for trust in your partners. Very timely for any of you who saw the Washington Post today that the Chinese government is suing us for human rights on 5G. He highlighted the critical importance of national security, human rights, and economic prosperity as a major reason to be striving towards an open, interoperable, and reliable and secure digital environment, which is why we are here for this discussion today. So may I introduce to you the Deputy Assistant Secretary to State for the Cyber and International Communications and Information Policy, Rob Strayer.
Good morning. Thanks, Shane, for that very kind introduction and getting my lengthy title right twice. We're all very fortunate for your affiliation with AEI because of the depth of experience that you have in technology policy issues and the excellent program, maybe notwithstanding my participation, that you've put together for today. As the world becomes even more interconnected, technology policy issues, cyber policy issues, and the digital economy become even more important to our national security, our economic success, and to human rights. The 5th generation of wireless technology, or 5G, will be transformative, providing throughput rates of up to 100 times what they are currently for 4G, and with very low latency. That is the time that it takes for a device to connect. That will allow, over the next few years, tens of billions of new devices to become part of the internet, what we call the Internet of Things. And these connections will power a vast array of new services, from autonomous vehicles and transportation networks, to telemedicine, to automated manufacturing, as well as through traditional critical infrastructure that we have today, such as the smart grid and water distribution. With massive amounts of data being transmitted through the Internet of Things, we'll also see huge advances in artificial intelligence. With all these services relying on 5G networks, the stakes for safeguarding these critical networks could not be higher. As countries around the world upgrade their telecommunications systems to 5G technology, we are urging them to take a risk-based approach to security. An important element of this risk-based approach is a careful evaluation of the hardware and software equipment vendors and their supply chains. The evaluation should include the exclusion of vendors that are subject to foreign government control that has no meaningful checks and balances on the power of that government to compel cooperation from the vendors with their intelligence and security services. Because of the essential role that vendors play in the networks and their maintenance, they could be ordered to undermine network security in a number of ways, to steal information or intellectual property, to conduct espionage, or disrupt critical services on those networks. There's been an active debate now on the technology front, so I'll dive a little bit into the technology point just briefly here, and that is about distinguishing between the core and the edge. In the core and the edge distinction in the 4G networks had referred to the parts of the network that were in the center, whereas the edge was referred to the not smart components that were at the edge. But in 5G, we're going to change the network architecture. We're going to push what are called smart components throughout the network, letting the network respond more quickly. This means that the previous security distinction between securing the core and the non-core, and that is between the critical and non-critical elements, vanishes. This new architecture will help deliver one of the key promises of 5G, that is to reduce latency in order to empower things like autonomous vehicles. Because of that massive reduction in latency, maybe down to 1/10 of what we have today, we're going to have much more processing and computing power near the devices in the network. By having that data processing closer to the user, the data travels a much shorter distance. From a security perspective, this is important both because it means that the edge of the network will control a larger volume of data, and it will also support critical applications like telemedicine and autonomous vehicles that will have huge safety and security implications. For 5G, unsecure components that are anywhere in the network, not just in the core, could interact to influence the network and have dangerous implications. For these reasons, we strongly disagree with countries that think they can mitigate risk by putting untrusted vendors only in the edge of their 5G networks. America's largest carriers have committed to only use trusted vendors in both the core and the edge of their networks and will be leading the world in 5G deployments. Now I want to take a minute to talk about China and why we're particularly concerned about the risk posed by Chinese equipment vendors. We believe that countries make decisions, as they make decisions about 5G security, they must do it in a broader context that takes account of China's efforts to manipulate the world system and to allow them to coerce and foster dependencies in the technology space. As made clear by Chinese law, most notably its national intelligence law in 2017, Chinese citizens and organizations are required to cooperate with Chinese intelligence and security services. In addition, the Chinese government does not have any meaningful checks or balances on its power. As President Xi Jinping told security officials in China in January, China does not intend to follow the Western road of constitutionalism, separation of powers, or judicial independence. Therefore, we are concerned that China could compel actions by network vendors to act against the interests of U.S. citizens and citizens in countries around the world, and they would be required to do so in secret. Chinese technology firms are already working with authoritarian regimes around the world, often hand in hand with the Chinese government, to suppress freedom of expression and other human rights through arbitrary surveillance, internet censorship, and targeted restrictions on internet access. For a disturbing example of this, we don't need to look any farther than the Xinjiang province and how the Chinese government is using Chinese technology for pervasive and arbitrary high-tech surveillance and involuntary collection of personal data. They've used this data to imprison and send more than 1 million Uyghurs to re-education camps. If Chinese companies build underlying 5G infrastructure, they will be in a better position to facilitate these activities around the globe. In addition, China has a long history of undertaking intellectual property theft to benefit its commercial interests where it's able to gain access. Last December, the United States announced that since at least 2014, Chinese cyber actors associated with the Ministry of State Security hacked multiple U.S. and global managed service and cloud providers. These cyber intrusions allowed China to compromise the networks of the providers' clients, and that included global companies located in more than 12 countries. Countries should not allow 5G to be yet another vector for China to acquire intellectual property from us. Lastly, but importantly, Chinese companies like Huawei have benefited from massive subsidies through state financing given them that provides them an unfair advantage. This morning's Washington Post reported that Huawei has more than $100 billion in state-backed financing from the government. Given the close connection between companies and the government in China, the national security risk from allowing Chinese equipment vendors into any part of a 5G network should be clear and compelling. The United States has taken strong action to ensure global leadership in the deployment of 5G security, including security, and ensuring that security is built into networks and supply chains from the start. Most recently, on May 15th, President Trump signed an executive order titled Securing the Information Communications Technology and Services Supply Chain. This executive order empowers the Secretary of Commerce to prohibit transactions involving information and communications technology or services that could be controlled by or subject to the jurisdiction of a foreign adversary and that posed an unacceptable risk to our national security. In fact, many other countries around the world, based on the advocacy that we've had over the course of last year, are now beginning to take steps to secure their supply chains. For example, last August, Australia issued 5G security guidance to Australian carriers to protect their networks from unauthorized access or interference by, quote, vendors who are likely to be subject to extrajudicial direction from a foreign government that conflict with Australian law. And in March, the European Commission released a set of recommendations to improve the cybersecurity of 5G networks, noting that the evaluations of equipment suppliers should include the risk of influence by a third country, notably in relation to its model of governance. This principle should be applied rigorously. And in May, the Czech Republic hosted representatives of almost 40 countries from around the world, and as well as the European Union and NATO, to build consensus on a common approach to 5G security. Those efforts produced the Prague Proposals, a set of recommendations on how to build secure and resilient 5G networks based on free and fair competition, transparency, and the rule of law. Moving forward, the Prague Proposals will help guide our engagements with our partners and allies to build 5G secure networks. We will continue our bilateral and multilateral engagements to ensure that telecommunications, the internet, and all critical services that 5G will enable are secure and reliable. Thank you for this opportunity today, and I look forward to the moderated discussion.
Thank you. I was going to recommend that everybody read your Senate Judiciary testimony because he did it in 3 pages. Anybody who reads testimony on a regular basis knows that 3 pages doesn't usually get to the core of things, and you did it, and it was amazing. And we wish that'd be an example for more people doing testimony. But one of the things that you bring up in there, and you touched on it in your comments, is the idea of the risk-based security framework. So you've been working in cybersecurity for a long time. This seems so counterintuitive to me that everybody's doing lots of belts and suspender works on their immediate networks, and then you're buying something that possibly is like right in the center of your network and saying, I don't know if you can trust it.
Yeah.
What do we do about that?
Well, and that's one of the sort of fallacies that I think cybersecurity professionals in some areas of the world, some telecom operators are falling into, is that they're focusing so much on what they call technical vulnerabilities. There are major improvements in 5G that will ensure better technical cybersecurity, including who has access, authentication, the way the networks are built. But it's critical to look at what we call non-technical factors, and that key one here is the supply chain. If you're a hacker and you want to have the best access to figuring out how to manipulate a network, you want to be able to go to the company that's designed the network. So you go to a company like Huawei and you ask them to provide all the software, source code, and plans for how the network operates. That will be a huge advantage to if the Chinese government were to decide they want to undertake efforts to undermine any of the critical infrastructure that rides on the 5G networks.
So when the let's just say the box shows up, everything seems like it's good, you can test that, and then as the updates start to flow, we need to make sure that all those updates are sanity checked, and if we don't know exactly what's going on there, that's where the camel's nose gets another tune, perhaps. Yeah.
It's exactly like this bottle of water. If I were to say, this has been tested in a lab somewhere else, but would you serve this bottle of water to a child every day? And you'd want to have better reassurance that you know what's in here and how it's been tested on a regular basis and that there are not changes to it. And your point about the software is absolutely true. There'll be updates occurring, patches and other types of updates almost on a daily basis. Any one of those updates could contain at least one line of source code that could cause a compromise to the entire network. There is no way that people and any type of review center could evaluate all the source code they would need to on a nightly basis to keep up with the volume of updates. And you wouldn't want to slow the updates because the updates are often contain security patches. So you'd have a difficult choice to make between trying to review all the source code and then continue with the updates to fix security flaws.
That was a recent point of interest, I guess I'll say, with our colleagues over in the UK. They came out with a report that said, yes, we have Huawei equipment in our 4G. We're considering it for non-core in 5G. They had was supposed to be a behind closed doors vote on this, which became public, and somebody lost their job, the head of defense. And so there seems to be a real concern by people who are in the intelligence community that this can't be secured once you put Huawei equipment in your system, even though the people on the domestic side, who I think were more worried about costs, thought it was fine. That's kind of the way I read through that. What do we do when our colleagues, the people that we trust, they're part of the Five Eyes, are starting to make decisions like that, and we trust them with many pieces of our intelligence community and information?
Yeah, so over time, we've had a great education campaign. I think a year ago, no one would have even acknowledged that they would have said, yes, cybersecurity is important to 5G, but they would have acknowledged that there is a supply chain vulnerability aspect to this that they need to closely analyze. So we are continuing to progress on the path of educating our partners and allies around the world. We need to keep making more progress on that point. That's why, in particular, today I wanted to highlight the core and the edge distinction. That is, there really isn't one in 5G, and there's no way to have any untrustworthy components in the network without having a serious vulnerability being inserted into that network. So it's really important that we continue these conversations and make sure that governments are talking to telecom operators to make sure they fully understand what's at stake here. The telecom companies obviously have, in many of these countries, already invested in Huawei. So they have a vested interest in keeping that Huawei equipment in their networks and not having to migrate away from it or pull it out of their networks over time, because that will cause them to pay more money. So it's really a decision for the governments to make about the national security of their citizens. And so we need to keep advocating and educating them about that national security decision that they need to be making.
You mentioned the Chinese subsidies to Huawei as well as the intellectual property. So they didn't spend a lot of money on R&D, from what we can tell. It was probably acquired. And they definitely are cheaper because they're subsidized. So how do we compete with that? That seems to be part of the challenge. There's a monetary element to this.
Yeah, there's a couple things. And the third thing I would just add to that very quickly is that there's a marketing campaign that's going on around the world that says that the Huawei technology is better than its competitors, being Nokia, Ericsson, or Samsung. We don't think that's true. In fact, our carriers in the United States are going to lead the world in trials and rollouts later this year, and they're only going to use trusted vendors of those three main radio access network companies. And in some ways, it's like the hit Taylor Swift song that they're using as their marketing framework. There's, which is the song "Me." It says, I promise you'll never find another one like me," which is not the case. Technology evolves. There's going to be improvements in those companies that surpass even where they are today, where Huawei is today. And there's going to be American innovation on this front, too. There's a broad ecosystem in Silicon Valley. Over longer term, we're going to move more to a system that's probably going to be more of a white box that is not smart. It's a dumb box, but the software will be what's providing the functionality, software-defined radios and other functionality. And that will really play to our strengths in Silicon Valley of writing that type of software. But back to your point about the financing. We're telling countries that it's important that they think about the long-term prospects of any kind of system where there is such undercutting of the financing market, in some cases 0% for 20 years, that no company can compete with that. You will begin to see an end to the type of Western technology that we need to have in these markets because they don't have the money, the profit to reinvest in R&D when they're being undercut by such a substantial amount. And the other part of the sort of unfair competition that's going on here is that China's market is locked up. There is a set percentage, a huge percentage, going to Huawei and ZTE, their protected companies, not to Western companies. So they do claim recently that they're being denied access to the U.S. market and complaining about that. But in fact, they're also blocking their own market at the same time. So they're using, in a sense, a cross-subsidization. They're able to get certain profits out of China, and then that lets them deliver their products into other markets, especially as they achieve economies of scale at much lower prices that undercut the competition. So we're urging countries to think about other types of financing mechanisms that won't be as concessionary as the 0% level, but help produce a more even playing field in the market for technology vendors.
So going to the executive order and sanctions, what is going? Kind of give us the lay of the land there. We've got certain people like ARMS thinking they may not be supplying to China, and what will that happen? What will happen with Huawei if that becomes the case?
Well, I can't really forecast the future on this. The Commerce Department is working hard on two different fronts. One is with regard to this executive order on securing our supply chain for protecting U.S. telecom networks. The other effort that they're in charge of is what's called the entities listing. Huawei was added to the entities list because of its long history of violating Iran sanctions. For more than a decade, they falsely claimed that they were not supplying their technology to the regime in Iran. And of course, 10 years ago, that included when the entire world was saying that Iran should have maximum sanctions against it. So they had done that, and then they did multiple efforts at bank fraud and wire fraud to deceive the banks that needed to clear the payments for that. So those activities caused them to be added to the entities list by the Department of Commerce. And so over time, the Department of Commerce will decide whether companies and their subsidiaries, there's more than 68 Huawei subsidiaries also on that list now, whether they stay on the list and any licensing that's associated with that.
I told you guys this is intriguing. There's all kinds of good stuff, including an arrest.
Yeah.
So what's going on with our other colleague in the Five Eyes, Canada, that was being helpful?
Yeah, so there was, there's been two major indictments against Huawei this year. One was for intellectual property theft, including a campaign to pay employees based on the amount of intellectual property that they stole and gave to the company. They received bonuses. The other one was this scheme to defraud banks in the world about their activities in Iran. That resulted in the indictment of their CFO, and we, the United States, asked Canada to arrest her in Vancouver and extradite her back to the United States. And we've seen how China has reacted to that. They've now indicted two Canadian citizens on fake charges in China, and they've also started to limit the importation of canola oil and pork products from Canada into China. So China is very much willing to put trade issues on the table to counter our national security protections.
And this morning, the Washington Post has a piece that Huawei is suing the U.S. government over human rights, which is rich.
Yeah.
So that is probably going to be on a longer tail, but it'll keep the intrigue going in this space as well. Any comments on that?
Well, I just think there's no comparison. It is rich. There's obviously no comparison. The ways that we use data, that we protect them in democracies, not just the United States, but the Western world, believes that there are protections on individual liberties that are so fundamental about the freedom of expression, about the freedom of association, and freedom of religion. We respect those. We respect those in all of our intelligence activities. The Chinese, of course, don't do that. If we look at how they treat the Uyghurs, more than 1 million of them, where they've treated Tibetan dissidents over the years, we also know they've rerouted traffic from the United States to China through China Telecom's presence in the United States. It's unclear why they were doing that, but probably for the same types of activities to suppress dissent and get access to information on dissidents. We would be naive to think that the way that China treats its own citizens will be better. They'll treat our citizens any better than they treat their own citizens. So, it's something that we should think very carefully about when we're thinking about using Chinese technologies that could potentially allow data from our citizens in the free world to be sent back to Beijing.
Switching to just pure cybersecurity, you recently were part of a transatlantic EU-US dialogue. Tell us a little bit about that.
So we have two major dialogues between our U.S. government and the European Union. One is with what they call DG Connect, which is roughly their communications ministry. We talked about a wide range of issues, including 5G, but there's a number of other technology concerns that we have, including authoritarian governments' use of data that we talked about. And then separately, we have a dialogue on cyber issues with the External Action Service. So the External Action Service is roughly their State Department, their foreign ministry, and is composed of the 28 member states itself. And it's really comprised of the member states under the flag of this External Action Service. So we talked about a number of cyber issues. The most important development, in my view, was 2 Fridays ago now. The European Union announced that they are going to be able to jointly impose sanctions against countries that act in malicious ways, or the actors in those countries. So they will be able to do asset freezes and visa bans for individuals who conduct malicious cyber activity. That's important because it starts to line up with our view that there should be consequences, costly, swift, and transparent, against malicious state actors so that we can start to change the fundamentals about activities in cyberspace. For a long time, we've worked to establish that there's certain normative behavior that should be adhered to, and we've increased the world in sort of understanding about the need to adhere to these rules of rational state behavior. But it's clear some states are not going to act in accordance with those without further convincing, without some kind of altering of the cost-benefit analysis for them. So it's very important that now Europe is saying that they will have available sanctions for malicious cyber activity.
Very important, because I know a long time ago we'd say we needed a cyber Pearl Harbor so somebody can finally understand what happens. We don't really need all of our infrastructure or our telecommunications to go down, but we are having it nibbled by ducks basically every day. Somebody's in there. There's lots of money being lost. There's lots of challenges in the nation-state actor versus commercial space that they've definitely found vulnerabilities in the way we conduct ourselves in the laws here. So I think that's very encouraging.
Yeah, definitely.
Open it up for questions. All right. Wow. Okay. We'll start over in this corner. Please introduce yourself, Milton. You got a mic runner here.
Milton Mueller, Georgia Institute of Technology and the Internet Governance Project. I think every argument you made about the security risks regarding Huawei equipment would apply to any vendor in any country. The supply chain for software and equipment is thoroughly globalized. If you just have to look at an Apple iPhone to know that. And so the issue in my mind is not, is China a bad authoritarian government and Huawei is from China, therefore they are a cat's paw for the takeover of the United States by China. The issue is how do we monitor and control the security of the supply chain? And just to ask you a very specific question, we all know that we've had a problem with Chinese espionage in U.S. networks. Can you name one of those problems? OPM, Anthem, anything? Can you name one of those that was in any way dependent on Huawei equipment?
So you're really asking, I think, the wrong question. So fundamentally, there's two pieces to the difference between other suppliers in the world and the Chinese suppliers.
No, wait a minute.
Yeah.
There is no Chinese suppliers. Qualcomm sends 30% of their chips to Huawei. You understand?
Yeah,
so by that token,
yeah.
China should cut off everybody
Yeah.
else, right, in the U.S.?
No. So the fundamental difference is when you go to Tim Cook or the Apple Board of Directors, they're responsible to our shareholders. They could receive shareholder derivative lawsuits. They're subject to American law. Huawei, that's not the case at all. They are beholden to the Chinese Communist Party and the dictates of Xi Jinping. There is no type of legal process that they're subject to that is transparent in any type of Western way. So that's the fundamental linchpin between how our companies differ and how Chinese companies differ. Now, the point about the supply chain, we all agree that we need to do a better job of securing the supply chain and should be careful about what's in the supply chain. But there's a fundamental difference between having one component part made in China. And I would note that increasingly, I think American companies are moving their production of smart components out of China to more secure places where they're more trusting about the protection of intellectual property. But there's a major difference between one piece and having the entire enterprise be under the direction of the Chinese Communist Party. And that's the point I was making earlier, was that it's the best thing for a hacker to have, or one that wants to manipulate an entire system, would go to the company and ask for the keys to the kingdom, the full architecture of everything, all of the source code, all of those controls in one place. It's just a fundamentally different type of risk that's at stake in a company that's under the control of a government like China.
Got a question right here in the center. The mic runner, sorry. Introduce yourself.
Steve Winters, independent consultant. I want to focus on the sort of struggle that's evolving now. And I downloaded the PDF that's the official statement of the 90-day reprieve that Google was able to get, and that's an extremely complicated document. I mean, not to say that I even understand it, but I can understand the sort of level at which the thinking that went in that document is. So I'm just saying we sort of have a past history of what's happened with economic sanctions. Just for example, the initial sanctions against Russia, and actually over another local think tank, the two people who drafted those sanctions gave a talk on them, and the point is, they didn't really work in the long run. They did cause a major disruption in Russian economy. So to cut to the chase here, there's sort of an argument before you get into a fight or a war. you should ask yourself, what's the end stage here? Where do we expect to end up when all the dust is settled? And what's so striking to me is with this tremendous struggle that's starting now, with Xi Jinping saying new people's war, new long march, he says we have to start over from the beginning. I don't see anybody here who's sort of looked forward a couple of steps to try and see once they respond and then we respond to their response, where this is supposed to end up.
Yeah. Shockingly today, I'm not going to lay that out for you in public. But let me just make sure I clarify one thing. So this entities listing that's occurred is distinct from normal sanctions. We've used economic sanctions as a tool of foreign policy to try to change behavior. And some people have viewed some of those sanctions activities previously as punitive measures. This is not a punitive measure. This is a way for us to say, because of the violations of the Iran sanctions regime, we're going to take this strong step against this company. They've continued to deny that they undertook this activity. And I would note back in 2007, the indictment reads that the founder of Huawei falsely claimed that they were not transferring the technology to Iran. So I think there's much more to be played out on this in public in later discussions.
I have time for one last question. We'll come over here. Thanks. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Kamal Thomas with the Carnegie Endowment. So over the past 5 years since countries started making deals with Huawei for the deployment and trials, we've seen that in response that some countries have taken a more risk-based management approach strategy, while other countries have moved to place restrictions and bans. So from having this divided approach, especially across Europe, what are the ramifications specifically for national security, commercial competition, as well as economic order?
It's a very good question. It's very broad. So there are obviously huge implications. If you look back, some of those deals go back 14 years. That's the first year that Huawei was introduced into British telecoms networks in the United Kingdom. I think over the coming months and even years, we're going to see use cases build out for 5G. And every time that a country seeks to expand its auctions or new use cases, we're going to see new decisions made about security. I think it's key at this point through our efforts. We've basically gotten almost everybody that's thinking about running a telecom network to agree that Huawei is too risky to include in what they consider the core of their network. So as I mentioned before, as this moves to a system where we don't really have a core and edge distinction because smart components, computing is moving to the edge, moving everywhere, we're hopeful that we can convince them that there should be no untrusted technology anywhere in those networks. So it's just going to be, I think, evolving over time.
Please join me in thanking the ambassador for being with us here this morning.
Thanks for having me.
In a program note, we're just going to set this up for a panel discussion, so just give us a couple minutes, and if my panelists will join me up here. Grab one more chair. Hold on a second, let me get. Got it, right, one more chair. All right, we're set back up, gentlemen.
Got nameplates over there.
Thank you. All right, while the panel's getting settled here, let me introduce them. So I have two of my colleagues here from the American Enterprise Institute today. Zach Cooper is a research fellow here. He studies U.S. defense strategy in Asia, U.S. alliances, and the partnerships in Asia, as well as the U.S.-China strategic competition in Chinese economic and statecraft coercion, which we're going to hear a little bit about. Mark Jameson is a visiting scholar here at AEI, where he works on how technology affects the economy and telecommunications and FCC issues. He's currently the director of the Guntner Professor for Public Utility Research at the University of Florida's Warrington College of Business. And then Peter Rasavi is the president of Rasavi Research and a consulting firm that specializes in wireless technology since 1993. He's written many papers that I recommend. Some of the most recent are Bad Ideas, Nationalizing 5G Networks Put to Rest. I guess we know where he stands on that. Untangling C-band for a New Broadband Future. Broadband Disruption and How 5G Reshapes the Competitive Landscape. And my personal favorite is how the Title II net neutrality undermines 5G. So we'll be hearing a little bit about that. And Zach, we're going to open up with you. If you can just give us a sense of what's going on in the political area of China with this whole telecom tech transfer.
Well, I think, first of all, Ambassador Strayer made some important points about the fact that this conflict, this struggle, didn't actually start with the United States and Huawei in the last few months. It started years ago, right, when China started trying to catch up in the late 1980s with the rest of the world on everything from information technology to manufacturing. And the way China decided to do that is the way rising powers typically have done so, which is to steal much of the technology, right? And the Chinese will say, well, the US did this back in the 1800s and late 1800s, and there's some truth to that. But the reality is that the scale of the Chinese theft has been far beyond anything we've seen before. So the public estimates are that something like $250 billion a year in US economic growth has gone away every year because of Chinese economic theft. So it's intellectual property theft, trade secrets, et cetera. And the other point I think Ambassador Strayer made, which is important here, is it's not that we're simply talking about barring Huawei from operating in the US and that US companies have open access to China. Major US tech firms haven't had access to China for quite a long time. Google, Facebook, Twitter, you can go on down the line. They can't operate in China at all. So the fact that we're talking about having some restrictions on Chinese technology firms is not new, and we didn't start this struggle. But I think that leads to a second point, which is important, which is that it's too easy, especially on Huawei, to conflate the concerns that we have. And I think this came up in one of the earlier questions. So I think there are sort of four major concerns, and you heard about a couple of them earlier. So one is Huawei's sanctions violations, especially on the Iran sanctions. And this is the one that's actually gotten the most attention recently, that has triggered most of the US legal responses. Second is Huawei's intellectual property theft. It's alleged that Huawei has been paying its workers to steal technology. The third is that Huawei receives substantial state subsidies. And the fourth is that Huawei is vulnerable to CCP coercion, the Chinese Communist Party coercion, because of the Chinese law in 2017, the national security law, that requires Chinese companies to basically do what the government wants on national security grounds. So these are serious concerns, but there is not a lot of open proof of major violations by Huawei yet. Now, it's possible that the US government has this, and it's somewhere that they haven't yet released, but we haven't seen a lot of evidence of the kinds of concerns that are being raised now about Huawei being used as a way to get into US networks. So I think that's one of the real challenges here. We've seen lots of bad actions by Huawei, but not the one that we're most worried about. And I think that leads to what will be my last point, which is that we are still struggling to get international support for the US position here. And I think Ambassador Strayer's got an incredibly tough job trying to sell these policies abroad. We've seen in some places we're starting to get traction, right? So Australia's led the way. I think you're going to see similar policies out of Japan, maybe Germany. But even if you look at the British are questioning some of these policies on 5G. And I think the real challenge is going to be, if you're a smaller country that wants cheap 5G technology, are you going to buy that technology from Huawei, or are you going to listen to the US and buy a more expensive system? And we don't know what the answer is. I think the US is betting that by putting more pressure on Huawei, we're going to open up a window, maybe a couple of years, where Nokia, Ericsson, Samsung, and others can really start to compete in these foreign markets. I don't know whether that's the case, but I think that's going to be the really big question in the years ahead.
Thanks. Zach testified on May 9th, and his testimony is available on the AEI website on bridging the transatlantic divide on China. To move to Mark, I'm just going to use part of Zach's testimony where he says, China has conducted industrial espionage on car manufacturing, renewable energy, chemistry, communications, optics, X-ray technology, machinery, material research, and armament industries. So that just tells us there's a lot of money in the things that they're going after. So Dr. J, can you give us a little econ? What's going on here? There seems to be a lot of money engaged in this 5G debate. So what's going on?
Okay, so let me just start with where the money is or goes. So this is a graph I drew actually for a different purpose a few months ago, but it's designed to look at what's been the impact of the iPhone on networks. So I broke it out for a little bit differently for this presentation. But what this shows is what I'm calling net resources. It's kind of like the accounting term net debt. It's basically how much cash does a company have minus its significant debts. And you can look and see how different parts of the industry have changed over time. The top lines show what I call the big four edge network resources. That's Facebook, Google, Amazon, etc. So there's the big four there. And then it also shows on the top the kind of what I call the two big hardware providers. That is Intel and Apple for the US. So I focused on those for that particular graph. The bottom part shows the network operators, the big four there, which is AT&T, Verizon, Sprint, and T-Mobile. And you can see there's a very big difference in how the evolutions we've had in networks and content have affected these different companies' finances. The companies on the top are awash with cash. They're bringing in more cash than they're using, and so their cash reserves are growing very fast. Been at a little bit of a dip-off lately for Apple, but otherwise there's a lot of cash there. For the network providers, it's been the opposite, that they've gone into a lot of debt to build networks. And so to be able to implement 5G, you can see that they're starting another borrowing spree, if you will, in some sense. They're bringing in more debt than they are cash in order to be able to finance where they're going. Now, I've talked with the network providers. None see this as a problem, and it probably is not for their finances. It's primarily to point out two things. One, where is the value? The value is showing up in the content and in the hardware provision and the innovations that happen there. Where the cash is going and the resources for doing things is also in that same place. What's harder is building the networks that actually make this all happen. There are probably a lot of reasons for that. One of them, I think it's really hard if you're a network provider to be different. All networks kind of look a lot alike. And I think this is one of the things that drove a lot of the net neutrality debate, is that we had networks which were looking fairly homogeneous, and the cash was then going to people that could differentiate themselves. So that is one of the kind of realities of the finances, the economics of this system, that the money is going into the content and into the manufacturing, and not so much into the networks themselves.
Thanks. So, Peter, that's a good tee up because you're going to explain a little bit about the technology here. We've heard about edge computing, dumb boxes, smart, better software. Can you explain to us a little bit what is going on with 5G, this next generation network, and where is all this money going?
The fundamental thing that 5G brings that previous generations of technology did not is that it's extremely flexible and it's extremely scalable. And the way it achieves that is by being able to use radio channels that were never before possible. Current cellular networks operate to about 3.5 gigahertz. 5G will run to about 100 gigahertz or higher. That's significant because there's much more spectrum available in these higher frequencies. It'll be able to use radio channels that are much wider, and throughput is directly proportional to the size of the radio channel. So 5G will be able to deliver gigabit per second speeds and higher. Theoretically, it can run up to like 20 gigabits per second. It'll continue to improve. It will support mission-critical applications through something called ultra-reliable, low-latency communications, where it is being designed to operate at what's called 6 nines of reliability, 99.9999%. So it suddenly becomes a feasible communications channel for industrial applications, drone control, all kinds of applications that absolutely require that the network always functions correctly. Because of these innovations, it will become intertwined throughout the economy in consumer applications, industrial applications, and as a result, having a network that is absolutely secure is fundamentally important.
So what are the current impediments to our progress? It sounds like we have some spectrum issues in front of us. How's that going?
Because 5G can use such a wide range of frequencies, you have to look at what's called the spectrum architecture. Previously, current cellular networks use low bands for coverage and higher bands for capacity. 5G actually changes that to what's really is a 3-tier spectrum situation where you need low bands still for coverage because lower frequencies propagate better, longer distances, they penetrate buildings. But we'll also have in 5G what's called mid-band frequencies, and right now the FCC is looking at how to open up what's called C-band from 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz. That will be absolutely critical. That mid-band tier is what most of the rest of the world right now is pursuing. The US is probably the country that's the most aggressive in deploying 5G in what are called millimeter wave bands. These are extremely high frequencies at about 25 gigahertz and higher. What millimeter wave brings you is extremely high capacity, but it requires a very dense network. Ultimately, we'll have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of small cells carrying these millimeter wave signals. So in the US, we're pursuing both the mid-band and the millimeter wave. There are auctions ongoing for millimeter wave. And right now, probably the biggest challenge in the US is making that mid-band C-band available.
So one of your papers is titled The Bad Idea of Nationalizing 5G Networks. Why is that such a bad idea?
It's a bad idea because it's about the worst wireless idea of all time. And there are so many reasons, it's hard to know where to start. But one of them is that the government has no competency in developing wireless networks. It has no assets, has no towers, has no fiber. But the other problem from a technical point of view is that 5G has to be extremely tightly integrated with 4G. 5G was designed to couple with 4G LTE, where LTE will provide the coverage, 5G will provide an additional capacity layer, and it requires that the operator have this very tight integration of spectrum. One method, for example, is carrier aggregation, where your phone will simultaneously have, say, a millimeter wave connection and a low band connection. And so if you momentarily step out of millimeter wave coverage, you'll still have the other band to provide connectivity.
It's kind of like going from Wi-Fi back to cellular, right?
Right, exactly, except it'll be much more tightly coupled than even that. Achieving that kind of coupling between a private operator network and a government network is just simply not going to be possible. So the user experience in trying to somehow technically couple a government network with a private operator network, it just simply will not be feasible.
So that was the palace intrigue part of our 5G, almost as good as GOT, where somebody dropped a PowerPoint last year saying this was a great idea, and then we just can't kill that idea. So it keeps popping up. Good to know that we're still trying to kill it. Dead. So we've gone through the technical build-out, the economics of it, and going back to geopolitical. Zach, can you talk to us about the Silk Road and what's going on here, the larger question about 5G and its adoption?
Right. Well, there's a lot of talk, if you read the newspapers, about something called now the Belt and Road Initiative. It used to be called the One Belt, One Road effort. And this is an effort by China in the last 6 years to build a global network of infrastructure. And there are a couple of reasons that China is doing this. One is trying to export its own overcapacity, and this is one easy way to do so. But another reason is that I think China is trying to build influence globally, and that this has some serious strategic implications. Initially, when we started talking about this Belt and Road Initiative, we were very focused on the kinds of infrastructure that are not smart and may not have hugely important implications in the long term, things like roads, rail, ports, airports, etc. Increasingly, parts of the Belt and Road are including digital connectivity, and this is, I think, one of the areas where people are increasingly concerned because, as Ambassador Strayer said, if you look at how China uses that digital connectivity in its own country, there's a huge coercive element. So in Xinjiang, there are, according to the US government, between 1 and 3 million Uyghurs in detention, basically. And there are video cameras everywhere that have monitoring of all of this population, and including monitoring of their families outside of China, right? So if you're worried about how do you monitor those families outside of China, well, it's a lot easier, potentially, if you own the networks outside of China as well. And so one concern that people have is that China will export this model of authoritarian control to other countries, and we're already seeing some of that. So if you're an authoritarian system and one concern you have is making sure that your population is controlled, what better way to do that than to export the systems and the technology from the place that does this the best, and that's China. So there are real concerns about digital connectivity. I'll say one thing to note about Belt and Road is that the promises have been bigger than the reality. So the actual amount of money spent thus far is something like $300 billion. Depending on who you talk to, the promised amount of money so far has been something like $1 to $4 trillion in expenditure. So we're seeing something like 15% of what the Chinese promise actually come to pass. But if you look at what's going on globally with networks worldwide, we're seeing a real push by China, not just by Huawei, but also by ZTE and other Chinese companies to engage themselves in these networks in ways that could be quite durable.
So, Dr. J, it sounds like the Chinese are helping some people pay for these networks, which is making it affordable to buy their equipment. But I think one of the things that gets confused, especially here in the United States, is who's paying for the build-out. So who's investing in this? What do we need to do to make them feel comfortable going into the 5G waters?
My understanding from talking with them is they're very comfortable with where they are.
Okay.
There's not a concern that they need help with financing of any of this. They're looking at their future cash flows and think that it'll be profitable. They'll be going into debt to get this done, at least in the early stages. But there doesn't seem to be a concern that this won't be profitable for them going into fifth generation wireless.
And there's a lot of industries that are looking forward to that. So we have healthcare, new healthcare monitoring, connected cars, obviously a lot of industrial applications with Internet of Things and the ability, and from what I understand this, and Peter, correct me if I have this, or let me know if I have this correct, is that we're going to see a lot more machine-to-machine is really the sweet spot on 5G. It's great that you might, we were supposed to have Roger Entner with us today. He's not here. He's always entertaining because he talks about how no matter how fast 5G is, the movie won't end faster, which I think is a good point. So it'll download faster, but it'll still be the same length to watch it. But so the whole idea of IoT and manufacturing, how far away are we from these promises that we keep hearing from our industrial partners?
Sure. I mentioned that 5G was going to be extremely flexible, and it achieves that by being designed at its core to support many different types of use cases. 4G really was a mobile broadband play, and so people's smartphones could stream YouTube videos nicely, and that was really the target market. With 5G, the use cases expands to what's called enhanced mobile broadband. So mobile broadband will still be supported, and it'll be even faster and will support much greater densities of users to the extent that 5G becomes a viable alternative for wireline broadband. So that's one major use case. But the other two that 4G doesn't really support nearly as well, one is called massive IoT, and that's the ability to have up to 1 million devices per square kilometer connect to the network. So these could be sensors in roads. It could be all different types of devices that are connected to the network. So that's something with 5G will provide. And then the other one is called mission critical. That's where you need very high reliability and very low latency. So there will be applications that require that kind of dependability. So it's the expansion of those use cases that really enable a lot of new business opportunities. It'll also be driven by a capability in 5G networks, which will be heavily virtualized, meaning that a lot of the 5G capability in the networks will run as software. And what that will enable is something called network slicing. With the network slice, an operator can provide a virtualized view of the network that's completely custom tailored, for example, for, say, autonomous cars for controlling the cars. And that might mean that you don't necessarily need super high throughput, but you may need extremely low latency. So by providing these slices for particular use cases, the operator can open up their businesses to a lot of new opportunity that they don't have right now. And so that's the goal with 5G. That's the way to make all this investment, which will ultimately be in the hundreds of billions of dollars of network investment, pay for itself from a business point of view.
So are we in a little bit of a chicken and an egg situation until the 5G next generation networks implemented? We are going to wait and see for some of these technologies, or can 4G handle some of the entry point on this?
Yeah, so I should mention the schedule, and that was part of your original question. Well, first of all, 4G does actually support many of these use cases, just not as well. 4G has made incredible strides recently for Internet of Things to be able to support very low-cost devices with better battery life. The goal for 5G is that you could have a battery-operated device that runs for 10 years. But from a scheduling point of view, just as in 4G, there were multiple releases of specifications with ever greater capability. The same will happen with 5G. The version of 5G that's rolling out this year is based on what are called Release 15 of 3GPP. That's a third generation partnership project specifications. The 3GPP is an international organization with participation globally. And they developed the specifications for cellular networks. In Release 16, which will be completed next year, that's where we bring on the mission-critical low-latency capability. Networks based on Release 16 won't be available until 2021. Just as we're now working on Release 16, the standards groups in June will finalize what will be the feature set in Release 17, which then further augments capability. You can see this with 4G LTE. 4G LTE came out with as Release 8 and then continued to improve all the way through Release 14. And there's still ongoing improvements in 4G LTE in current versions of the specifications. So 5G will, throughout the 2020s, experience continual improvement. But yeah, so some of these mission-critical capabilities aren't available yet, but they will be available in the 21-22 timeframe.
So part of the build, I'm sorry.
Yeah, could I just
Sure, absolutely.
put our two topics together for a
Yes.
moment, if I could? So there's this issue of what's the role of government versus what's the role of business. From a business perspective, network provider's perspective, there are a couple of things you want to do in this space. One is to make sure you have a diversity of vendors. You always want the vendors competing, and that's the other thing. And then you're always testing to see how are they performing, and they're competing for the next contract. You also want to get them into price wars, which helps you tremendously as well. And I think that helps strategically as you think about some of the issues we've been talking about. The role of government is this police role, which is we've got a national security issue. We want to put up whatever kind of barriers are necessary to effect that policing role. But there are other things as well, and one is to pay attention to what are the choke points, and this is what he was talking about with respect to standards. There are some gates through which everyone must pass, and standards is one of those, and the government needs to be very, very diligent to make sure that those bodies are doing work that is good for the businesses, good for the consumers, good for the technologies, and not necessarily stepping into that geopolitical battle.
So one of my colleagues here, Claude Barfield, wrote a blog with all the questions he wanted me to ask you. That's one way to make sure they get asked. And He was specifically going to the question of if we are to, let's say, avoid using Huawei equipment, can the alternatives, which are currently Ericsson and Nokia and Samsung coming up in the chase here, are they going to be able to fill the void? Do we think that, we don't know?
Well, from a technical point of view, they can certainly fill the void. They're
Okay.
extremely competent companies, and I work with their chief engineers all the time. There's no question that they have the expertise and capability of providing this technology. It becomes more of a business question, I think, globally from a competitive point of view. Can they compete against a company that is receiving heavy subsidies and, in some ways, unfair advantages?
Which goes to the manufacturing part of this. So, Zach, talk to us about rare earth minerals and how that plays into our success in this area.
Well, one of the challenges we're seeing is that as we start using some of America's best advantages to put pressure on Chinese companies, the Chinese are responding back. And the Chinese don't have the kind of options we have, right? In part because we control the dollar. We have huge influence globally in the international sanctions regime. But what the Chinese do have in some cases is control over manufacturing and control over some sectors of commodities, such as rare earths. And so you can go back and look at how the Chinese have used economic statecraft in the past, and they typically try and find an asymmetric advantage, and rare earths is a perfect one, where China has a large portion of the market, in part because China has just been a cheaper producer. There used to be producers outside of China, and many of them have gone out of business. And so China has often used this as leverage. It did so with Japan over the Senkaku Islands. It basically cut off rare earth exports, not just to Japan, but also in some cases to other countries in the region. And there was a World Trade Organization case about this. And just recently, in the last week or two, we've seen the Chinese government very clearly messaging that they are going to put rare earths on the table and threaten potentially to cut off access to rare earths again. And I'm not the technical expert, but you'll see rare earths are basically a component of almost everything you use in a smartphone. Everything from parts of the microchip to parts of the glass on the phone to ways that to all kinds of applications in automobiles and on and on. So this is hugely important to major countries. And I think what we're going to see is both the United States and China looking for where these asymmetric points of leverage are. And for the US, the entities list, which is run by Commerce, is a perfect kind of point where we have huge leverage, right? We can basically cut off Huawei from access to US technology. They need all kinds of US technology to actually remain in business. And so I think the Chinese are looking for what their leverage points are, and rare earths is a pretty good one for them.
Yeah. Could I add to that?
Sure.
Because that is an important role then for the government to not only worry about where the property rights, if you will, for the rare earth elements, but can we develop substitutes for them? They're important because they have particular physical properties. And I was part of a research project a few years ago where we were trying to deal with rare earth elements in solar panels, because they're there as well. We were trying to develop alternatives to that. So that is a good role for the government, is to fund some of that basic research in material science and physics, that can we develop alternatives to these, because that reduces a choke point, which then means the economy is going to work much better.
And just one other point to add on that, rare earths sound like they're rare, but they're not actually rare, right?
A good marketing campaign.
That's right. Rare earths are basically, the difficult part is getting what you want out of the rare earths out of the actual material that you're filtering it from. So it's not that China has some commodity that we don't have. In fact, much of the rare earths that we buy from China are actually mined from the US and sent to China for processing. It's just that the process you go through to actually get the rare earths is not environmentally friendly, and so it's difficult to do in many foreign countries and a lot easier to do in China. But if we wanted to get back in the rare earths game, for example, we could do it. It would just take some time. And so I think this is one area where you're going to try and see U.S. policymakers trying to figure out where are the leverage points that China might push on, and do we have ability to actually pay down those leverage points and make ourselves a little bit less vulnerable in those areas.
Very beginning of the supply chain there. So in the executive order, we have recommended to our allies that they help us in this. What about semiconductor chips? How much is that going to be able to hobble some of the challenges that we have with this Huawei-China situation?
It's a good question. Maybe more of a question for the technical experts, I think. But the reality is Huawei needs all kinds of technologies And you saw this with ARM just recently. You saw it with Google on the software side. And if the US actually does go ahead and ban Huawei from access to those technologies, it's not that Huawei won't be able to find alternatives, but it's going to take them time, and the alternatives won't be as good. And so I think it's going to depend on exactly which part of the market you're looking at. If you're trying to buy a Huawei smartphone in the United States and you don't have access to Android, that's going to be a big problem for Huawei, and it's not clear that they're going to be able to solve it anytime soon. I'll leave it to the technical experts on how easy it is for Huawei to find another architecture beside ARM to build their chips on, but my sense is it's going to take some time, but it's not undoable. It's going to be expensive, however.
Yeah, that's basically true. It's not something I've analyzed in detail, but some of the technologies they depend on are extremely complex. So if they're completely cut off from those technologies, it will take some time. It's not that they don't have a lot of their own technology. Huawei is investing hugely in R&D and has a massive R&D staff, and they're one of the 5G modem vendors out there, so it's not as if they build everything from other companies' components, but they do rely on a certain number of external components, and if they're cut off from those, they will have to adjust in a serious way.
So taking a step back from this to a different conversation, just because it's another one that I like to finalize here, is the net neutrality situation with 5G. Can you just walk us through why those two are not compatible, since you wrote a whole paper on it?
As I mentioned, 5G is being designed to address a lot of new use cases, and a lot of those new use cases are ones where data has to be delivered in a very particular way. And if you think about it, every application does have its own unique set of requirements as far as what kind of throughput it requires, what reliability of packet delivery it needs, how much latency it can tolerate. For example, a video stream, if you have a device receiving a video stream and it's buffering data, if there's occasional lags in the communication, a user will never notice because there's already a buffer, and these streaming applications are designed to be able to tolerate a wide range of throughput. On the other hand, if you're trying to send a short message to a car that there's a pedestrian in the street and it's a blind corner, then that data has to be delivered extremely reliably, extremely quickly, even though it may not be much data. The way you achieve providing the best network experience for these applications is through something called quality of service. And quality of service refers to being able to control parameters such as throughput, what kind of packet loss you can tolerate, latency, and so forth. 5G has a comprehensive quality of service architecture, as does 4G LTE. Operators never really were able to leverage that QoS capability because ultimately the way you achieve latency control and throughput control is through something called traffic prioritization. And the idea of network neutrality is that you have to treat all packets equally. That means somebody's video stream, every packet is just as important from a strict network neutrality perspective. Every packet is as important as that packet going to the car telling it to hit the brakes. That just doesn't make sense, right? It's just a fundamentally flawed concept. And if we're going to realize the potential of 5G and be able to apply that network technology to all these new use cases, we have to be able to prioritize traffic accordingly with the objective of providing the best user experience across all applications. It's not a zero-sum game. People think that because you prioritize one stream that you're going to provide an equally bad experience on another stream. That's just not the case. As I mentioned, different streams, data streams or application streams have different requirements, and you can set out to provide the optimal experience across all these streams. The network slicing capability I mentioned in 5G absolutely depends on QoS management and traffic prioritization. That's why just a simple-minded network neutrality approach of just saying that you have to treat all traffic equally doesn't work in a 5G context.
That was a bit of an aha moment for me, so I wanted you to reiterate that. Thanks. Any comments from the panel before I open for questions? You guys feel good? All right, let's go to the audience. Please introduce yourself and wait for a mic runner. Questions? We've answered them all. Wow.
Claude,
Right.
you know Claude's answer question.
Right.
Tricia Paoletta from Harris, Wilcher and Grandis. Awesome panel. Thank you, Shane, for gathering this illustrious group of folks. And I have a question. Any of you can answer, but maybe Peter is best positioned. But there's been a lot of discussion by policymakers here in Washington about the importance, and you hit on it today, of having more U.S. participation in standard setting. But because that is an open process, I'm thinking of 3GPP, IEEE on the Wi-Fi side. I mean, yes, China has far more engineers than we will ever have in the United States just by, well, for lots of reasons, population, but also focus of their education system. But, why is that important if we're there? And of course, they're sharing everything because they've got so many. But if we're participating, I mean, why is it so critical to have kind of a match on the numbers game from Western and U.S. and other, allied companies and governments?
Well, there's multiple reasons it's important. One is you have to understand how the specifications are set. And it's not necessarily a consensus process of a bunch of engineers sitting around a table saying, how can we design this thing in the future? Usually you start off with a set of objectives about what the capabilities will be for a technology. And then the standards groups receive contributions from companies, which are proposals on how something might work. The proposals that get the greatest attention are the ones where a company says, well, here's our proposal, and it's based on something that we already built, and we know it works, and we can demonstrate it to you. So those proposals are just inherently more credible. So if a company or if a country is starting to lead in a certain area, they can end up influencing the standards so that the standards favor their technologies. And that's one reason why it's so important that this 5G competency exists on a global basis. It's not that the U.S., we don't have any infrastructure vendors other than Cisco and Intel, which are not generally mentioned, but as we go to this virtualized environment, those kinds of companies will play an ever greater role. But those companies are heavily involved, and then Nokia, Ericsson are from Europe, and it is a global stage, but increasingly, and I don't have the exact details, but my understanding is that there's a lot of Chinese representation that is, really disproportionate to a fair representation of kind of a global participation effort.
Other comments? Actually, Claude, did you have a question? Did you? I'm going to give Claude prerogative.
Hi, Claude Barfield, AEI. Administration this morning gave a very optimistic view about our trading partners and what they're going to do about 5G. It looks, though, at least in the near to medium term, we're losing the argument. So they're going to put in Huawei equipment. I'd be interested in to go over this. You've touched on this, but maybe in a little more detail. The argument there is, which the administration again this morning challenged, that you can separate out the core from the periphery. And I think it's CHQ and other security agencies in Europe have said that is possible. I know there's still controversy in each of these countries. Could you comment on that? And secondly, how soon will the alternative that does not use Huawei or cuts its influence, how soon is that likely to come? So what would the administration, what will the administration do, let's say a year from now, 2 years, a year and a half, 2 years from now, where it faces a situation where you've got Huawei equipment in some of our lives, including maybe one or two of the Five Eyes, and you still have the security question. And I was curious also, just one footnote, the point that was made about the close connection between the 4G and 5G, that if you've got 4G in your equipment already, the close connection between that, beyond just the economic, there is an economic question, but also a technical question of changing your vendor to another vendor when that vendor has not really been a part of your 4G? Thank you.
Well, that's a number of questions, but as far as when virtualization will happen, that's happening now. There are a number of virtualization efforts involving different standards and alliances. Some of the important ones are ONAP, and there's something called ORAN, the Open Radio Access Network, where at the radio level and the baseband control, that will be virtualized. ONAP is the Open Network Automation Platform, which is a way of bringing on services. There's the network function virtualization infrastructure, NFVI project, and major operators are involved with that. So across the whole protocol stack, from the radio up to the application layer, and how virtualization plays into that, there are standards efforts with open APIs and so forth. So that's very real, and the goal of 5G is to work in a virtualized way that provides the benefits of being able to deploy services faster, having the software be, having the operation be controlled by software, not having as high a hardware dependence. So I'm very... Well, that really depends on a particular operator situation. If all the radio units are Huawei, then you really have to go in there and replace those. As far as the coupling between the edge and the core network, it is theoretically true that there are well-defined standards on how the radio access network interacts with the core network. So in theory, if you separate the core from the RAN, you should be able to mitigate the security risk, but I think many people are skeptical of that, myself included, because one of the concerns is not necessarily just eavesdropping, but the ability to compromise a network, or even under some extreme scenario of turning off the network. If you have control of the radio access network, which is really 80% of the network, 80% of the investment or more is in the radio access, all the towers and connections to the towers and so forth. So if a foreign entity has control of that 80% of the network, that means they can compromise and do malicious things to that part of the network. So I really don't see that you've mitigated the risk that much by just having control of the core.
Just one thing to add on Claude's points, and I think his blog had some fantastic questions and is worth looking at. If you think about how the U.S. has succeeded or not succeeded in the last few years in trying to compete with China globally, I think the best case to look at is how the U.S. responded to the Belt and Road Initiative or to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. In both cases, the U.S. basically went to its friends and said, here are all the risks, here's why we think you shouldn't sign on board. And most places basically signed on board. And they said, yeah, there may be some risk here, but this money is cheap and we need it and we're going to take it. And now we're finding ourselves trying to help them figure out, well, how do you mitigate the risk to taking Belt and Road money? I think my concern is that we're going to see the same kind of pattern on 5G, which is, yeah, you're going to convince a small number of your friends that the risk is too high and they'll walk away. But most of the countries in the world that need cheap infrastructure, they've been taking Belt and Road money because they need the infrastructure and we don't have anything positive to offer them. And so if we don't have a positive offering that competes effectively at a rate at a price that they think that they can bear, I think it's going to be a hard sell globally for the United States.
Just to add, what GCHQ said in their report on mitigating risk is there's the ability to do the workaround, but then that adds cost and time. And there's also a human element to this, that you need to have that, not only trust the machine, but trust the people that are pushing the updates, and there's still space for humans in technology. To a point. Is there a question over here? Right over here, to the mic.
Hi, John House from the Computer Communications Industry Association. There have been a few comments from the panelists and also some of the questions about standards. Wanted to know if the panelists could speak a little bit more about patents, particularly standard essential patents. Huawei has been dominating there, and especially in the wake of the FTC Qualcomm case, if that were to be overturned, how could that affect Huawei's ability to dominate as Qualcomm has? Thank you.
I don't think I'm not a patent expert.
Much about patents either.
Yeah.
Anybody a patent expert in the room want to take that one on?
Yeah, it's hard for me to comment exactly on how that would impact Huawei. I mean, they have been filing a great number of patents, and that is true. And the standards essential patents, that refers to patents that are essential for implementing the standard. So if you're going to comply with the standard, that means you have to get a license for that particular patent. Now, there is a process to ensure that those standard essential patents are licensed at what are considered fair rates, that a company that doesn't have a standard essential patent, to prevent them from charging exorbitant rates that makes them extremely rich at the expense of everybody else. But how exactly that would play out in light of policy, I don't have good insight on that.
Let me add something that's not on point, but at least related. And it'll be interesting to see how antitrust plays out in this. I don't think we would see an antitrust issue in the United States. As I articulated earlier, I see it primarily as a policing issue with respect to the topic we've been talking about. That wouldn't necessarily be true in Europe. If you look worldwide, Huawei has it's about 30% of the telecommunications equipment manufacturing worldwide. It's about 30% of that. Since it's not a very large presence in the United States, that means there are other places where once you define a market, you would find they would have a greater than 40% market share, which is a magic number for Europe. Because once you exceed 40%, you have significant market power, and the rules of the game change fairly considerably for companies. It'll be interesting to see if Europe ever takes that up. And if they did, what the consequences would be. I don't know how that would play out, but I think that could be something intriguing to see.
We had another question over here in the back.
Hi, good morning. My name is Bimal Serene. I'm Cyberforce. One, you mentioned 80% of the network is based on radio access. The question that immediately comes to mind is jamming. How exposed are we to such issues? That's number one. Just a couple of points related to that.
Did you say jamming?
Jamming. I mean, obviously, we're looking at radio spectrum. Each of those spectrum is subjective to interference. Mm-hmm. So, they obviously have an element of disruption there. Leave aside potential health thing, but that's less relevant on this discussion. We talked about the network slices. I'd like to understand your perspective on security for each of those network slices, especially as it could transcend geopolitical boundaries. Because you could have large network slices running some application in a mission-critical mode, which would be, obviously, the security of that would be rather important. And so obviously the security exposure of that. And the last topic that I was doing some work on is considering we're going after and raising this issue, don't we in the US need to figure out a way of getting back a US manufacturer? We have enough private equity around there. We have the ability to acquire champions and develop champions and create our own to provide that element of security which we so desperately need, and we have now given up to European and South Korean and Chinese telecom providers, just as a thought.
Let me take the first question on jamming. There are, yes, if you have this massively distributed network, it is susceptible to jamming, but that would be localized. I think the greater threat or the security concern is what could a malicious actor do that might affect the entire network, and that's why you really need trusted vendors. As far as security, To the slices, 5G does have a comprehensive security architecture, which includes encryption, mutual authentication between devices and networks. Every generation of cellular technology has had fairly well thought out security mechanisms that over time maybe didn't turn out to be as secure as originally hoped. But the engineers have taken everything they've learned and tried to design 5G to be as secure as anybody knows how to make a network today. That doesn't mean someone down the road won't figure out exploits. That will happen. But hopefully all those holes will be addressed. And the security mechanisms available in 5G will apply to each network slice. So I think those slices can be secured accordingly as long as all the vendors participating are diligent in their devices. Many of the vulnerabilities today are low-cost IoT devices where security was an afterthought. So the only way we can really make any of these networks and devices secure is if security is designed in from the beginning.
And with respect to getting a manufacturer in the United States, it's largely a matter of economics. They've chosen to go someplace else because labor's more expensive in the United States. Right now we have a labor shortage. Environmental regulations keep it more expensive. It's just cheaper to do it in other places.
We have one last question, the woman in the white in the back here.
Good morning, Carolyn Brandon from Georgetown. Thank you, Shane, for pulling this event together. It's been incredibly informative. Interestingly enough, I will get to my question in a quick second, but in response to the manufacturing question, some of the research I've been reading out of a variety of different think tanks here in town suggests that 5G is actually a potential mechanism for bringing digital manufacturing to a variety of locations throughout the United States. So the very topic that we're discussing today could in fact be a way to bring back some manufacturing, as you say. So here's my question. We read all the time, the U.S. is winning or the U.S. is not winning the, quote, 5G race, and in most cases it's in comparison with China. Here's my question as an English major. What exactly does, quote, winning the 5G race look like from each of your perspectives? And then separately, what if we, quote, lose the 5G race? What do you think that looks like? Thank you.
Who wants to start?
Start.
Hashtag winning.
All right, I'll start. Winning 5G means having 5G, well, it means at least a couple of things. It means, one, having 5G networks out in a timely fashion. And that is happening. All the major operators by the end of this year will have some amount of 5G deployed, and that will accelerate over the next several years. I don't think that is really a concern, and especially in these more challenging millimeter wave bands, the U.S. is more aggressive in those bands, or as aggressive as any country around the world. We still need to get the mid-band spectrum on board as quickly as possible. But another aspect of winning is just having 5G competency. It means having the patents. It means having companies developing the software for these virtualized networks. And I think it remains to be seen how involved U.S. companies will be in that. But I think as the networks become more open and more virtualized, it will make it easier for other organizations or other companies to start competing in this area. So I am cautiously optimistic about that. And as far as what it means to lose, I'd rather not think about that. I think it's just too important at this stage.
Yeah. As I think about winning or losing in the race, if you will, is to think in terms of there's multiple types of races. And the one we tend to run in the United States is, do we have a set of rules and practices that allow the consumers to get the biggest bang for their bucks as they can, both as consumers and as producers? They can really take their way and do well. That's not how the journalists count it, of course. The journalists take a much easier answer, and they'll go out and try to count 5G equipment and things like that. And so that horse race will be different, and we may or may not win that one, but that's okay. We're not here to serve journalists. We're here to serve the citizens of the country. And in that, we're probably on a fairly good path.
And I'm going to have a slightly different answer, which is, I think there are two components of the race that I worry about. One is the U.S.-China economic competition, and clearly there are a lot of people in the White House who are very worried that the U.S. is falling behind in general, and in part because China has been stealing U.S. intellectual property and using unfair state subsidies and joint venture requirements and market access restrictions to drive U.S. and other Western firms out of these markets and grow to dominate them as they have in things like solar. So I think one concern is whether the U.S. and its allies and partners can keep their companies afloat amidst this kind of pressure. The second concern, I come from the defense background as a war planner, and so 5G is fundamentally different for a defense planner than other network security because many of our defense applications will ride on 5G. And that is different than how this has operated in the past. And so if you think about the US trying to project power in a contingency into, say, Europe, and you have forces flowing through all parts of Europe, well, it would be pretty nice if you were watching those networks to feel secure that your adversary doesn't know exactly which forces are flowing and where they're going. Same thing in the Pacific. So, I think there's going to be a lot of concern from the defense standpoint about whether you are confident that if you start moving forces, that your adversary doesn't know exactly where they are so that they can actually get after them.
Great. Your summer reading lists are right in front of you. All these guys have written amazing material around this, so please join me in a round of applause for thanking our panelists.
Okay.
Relationship between 5G and IP protocol. Like